Well, good morning and welcome back to another episode of the PeliCast. I'm so grateful you have taken some time to join us for this conversation. I am Daniel Erspamer, CEO of the Pelican Institute. As many of you know, the Pelican Institute is Louisiana's free market think tank, and our mission is to ensure that every Louisianan has the opportunity to flourish. As you know, many debates raging on these fronts. We've covered issues from individual liberty to tax reform, lots of different topics here for the PeliCast. We did take a little hiatus there for the summer. I hope you enjoyed some R&R, but we are back in force now. And a major issue relative to the ability for everyone to pursue opportunity, of course, is education policy here in Louisiana. Lots of different debates raging on this front now, and one that will be in front of our Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. I think some of those members are even joining us watching today on the PeliCast. Will be a question of accountability. This is a frankly often little known and even less understood component of how the public school system here in Louisiana is governed, how dollar allocations are made, and those letter grades that you see on your schools and districts all drive from a formula of accountability, and lots of discussion about that. So we are going to dive right in and try to understand better what are best practices as our elected officials and education policy leaders are debating accountability. What should we be considering? What are some examples? And we've got some excellent and expert guests with us today as we cast around to see which states seem to have applied accountability most effectively to student outcomes. One of those states is Mississippi, another is Florida. Certainly some others have done this. And so let's dive in and better understand. We've got three excellent guests today. First, from ExcelinEd, the Senior Policy Fellow and maybe the nation's premier expert on school accountability policy, Christy Hovanetz. Thank you for joining us. From Mississippi, we also, again, as I mentioned, Mississippi has done some really impressive work on this over the last several years, and we have two of the leaders of that effort just next door, our friends, our neighbors in Mississippi, Dr. Carey Wright. We're honored to have join us, the State Superintendent of Schools in Mississippi, and her colleague, Dr. Paula Vanderford, who is the Chief Accountability Officer for the Mississippi Department of Education. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Dr. Vanderford, I think I like your title best, Chief Accountability Officer. It sounds very whip cracking. I like it. Very good. Well, Christy, if I can start with you, when we think about accountability, this is something probably a lot of our viewers haven't spent much time thinking about. If they have, maybe they've scrolled through School Finder on the Department of Education website and seen a letter grade or heard a school board member talk about it. Can you just tell us broadly, what is accountability? What are we talking about here from a policy perspective?
Sure. When we talk about school accountability, we want to make sure that schools are doing what they are given taxpayer dollars to do to educate students. And we want to be able to report that information back out to multiple audiences as far as whether or not students are meeting state standards. So we want to hold schools accountable for making sure students are learning what they need to do in order to be successful once they graduate from high school.
Simple enough, right? Christy, before we dive deeper into policy, can you just, ExcelinEd is a great organization, a great partner. Could you just tell us a little bit about the organization and what our viewers should know about it?
Sure. Our organization is a nonprofit organization based out of Tallahassee, Florida. Our chairman is Governor Jeb Bush, former governor of Florida. I had the opportunity of working for him for both administrations. We implemented a lot of good education reform policies in Florida that improved us from being some of the among the worst performing state in the nation to among the best performing state in the nation on multiple measures. As a result of that, A lot of other states were interested in what he did during his tenure. So he created a nonprofit organization. We are entirely privately funded and work in states at will. So if you're interested in working with us, it's just as simple as a phone call, and we'll be there to help you.
That's great. And, I think certainly ExcelinEd and Governor Bush in the state of Florida have done such great work, not only in accountability, but in expanding options for children and parents, and expanding that school choice program in Florida, and just the results speak for themselves. And we've got a lot of work to do to catch up with you. So thank you for that good work. Dr. Wright, if I can start you, and then Dr. Vanderford, I'll ask you the same question. Just give our viewers a little bit about your background and the path that led you here to the role you lead now.
Well, started out as a classroom teacher, was an assistant principal, a principal, director for special ed and student services, assistant superintendent, chief academic officer in the DC public schools, and then here as the state chief. So I've been here in November. It will be 8 years. It's hard to believe, but 8 years in November.
Yeah. That's great. Dr. Vanderford.
So I started in the classroom as well, and then worked my way through some administrative internships, and then landed a role here working with the Office of Accreditation. And we have a performance-based accountability system, which does include school grades, as we refer to them now. And so that was initially years ago, prior to the reorganization, a part of that office. And so then as I've had several positions here, the oversight that I have now as the chief is the Office of District and School Performance, which is responsible for producing the grades for schools and districts.
That's great. That's great. Thank you very much. So as you think about accountability, and Dr. Wright, maybe we'll start with you. How should states think about accountability, or maybe even more specifically, how do you in Mississippi think about the role of accountability in the public education system?
Well, to me, accountability drives the behaviors that you want to see in classrooms and in schools. And I think you need to start with that premise. Like Christy just said, what is it that you want to see happening in schools? And an accountability system really does hold people responsible for that. So when we first started with our accountability system, we were literally 50th in the nation. Our proficiency rates were horrible. And our graduation rate was low, and our dropout rate was high. And so we knew when we built the accountability system that we had a lot of children that were well below proficiency. So we built in a measure of proficiency, obviously, but then we also knew that we had a lot of kids that were at the bottom. So we then added a measure around increasing the proficiency and growth of the bottom 25%. So even your best schools have a bottom 25%. So in ELA and math, we have an overall proficiency, but we also have a measure of growth in the bottom 25% in ELA and math. We also, at the high school level, we knew graduation was an issue, so we made that a prominent part of our high school model, so that graduation made a difference. And so when you start putting and shining lights on what it is that you need to improve, an accountability model is probably the best way to go about doing that.
That's great. That's great. Dr. Vanderford, anything to add to your perspective on that?
I'd like to add a little bit of background of how we got to where we are today. I don't want to say how long I've been here doing this work, but we're on the implementation of the third accountability model since I've been employed with the Department of Ed. And our previous two models were very complicated. They were not really transparent. It did not provide the district level administration nor the school level administration, particularly the teachers, the data that they needed in order to improve instruction. So when we were planning to regroup and formulate a new model, we looked around the nation to see who was doing well and what their models looked like. And Florida was one of the models that was selected, and we invited ExcelinEd, and so Dr. Hovanetz has been here with us for a number of years working our way through this, but we wanted to ensure that we had a model that was designed to be very transparent, that was easy to understand, that when a school or a district received a grade, and a parent could interpret that grade and to know how that student or that district was performing, or that school. And I think that's what we accomplished. And then tying in all that Dr. Wright said, included all of the components that we felt like would drive the behavior and the outcomes that would improve student achievement as well as improve our graduation rates.
I think that's a really, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's the key is if you're looking at the components of a model, it's not just the proficiency, because if you're looking at the other end, at the high school end, it's also your acceleration component, like how many kids are taking dual credit, dual enrollment, how many kids are involved in advanced placement classes, IB, et cetera. And also a measure of college career readiness we added, which is a measure that we look at our high schools around ACT. We administer that to all of our 11th graders. So I think each model, whether it's elementary, middle, or high, has to reflect what it is that you want teachers to be driving toward as they are working throughout the year. And so each of those components has a little bit of a different nuance depending on what you're expecting from elementary, middle, or high.
Sure. And you mentioned ACT. What is the standard? What is the sort of grade, the number at proficiency that you measure for ACT?
Well, it's not really a proficiency measure. It's the national, it's a more of a national composite that we are looking at. And so that is something that we did. And talking about, just to back up for a second on acceleration, the one thing that we did also was that we eased that in around participation and performance. So we didn't jump in immediately with the weight as heavy as it is now on performance, because we knew we needed to get more kids access. So we gave a little bit of a leeway and more credit initially to participation, but then each year we increased the flip the points, if you will, so that now it is performance that we really are weighing more heavily than participation.
And to add to what Dr. Wright's saying, I think this is a real imperative point, is they've maintained rigorous expectations for all students. So their ACT component requires students to earn a score of 22 or 18, depending on math or reading for their composite. And that's the only score they can earn in order to get credit in that particular component. And the reason those scores are selected is because that's what ACT has determined. If you score at, you have a 50% chance of earning a B or 75% chance of earning a C in college level entry coursework. So they really have done a good job of maintaining rigorous expectations for all students and keeping their accountability system aspirational and making sure that if the student does reach that outcome, it's meaningful to that student. A student reaching an outcome that is not an 18 or a 22 based on reading or math on the ACT is not going to help that student. They're still going to have to take remedial courses in college, pay for those credits that they're not earning towards a degree. And we are telling them and telling the school that that's an acceptable outcome if we didn't, if we included those lower scores in our school accountability calculation. So I think that's a really important point, that Mississippi has maintained that rigorous expectation, not only in ACT, but also with their proficiency expectations. They have a very high expectation for students meeting mastery of standards and a very high expectation for what it takes to demonstrate a year's worth of progress in a year's worth of time. And they measure against a standard there too. So that's one thing that sets Mississippi aside and apart, in addition to all the good indicators that they're including, but the rigor of those indicators as well in their system.
I think that's so important. That's obviously been a big topic here in Louisiana, some discussion of moving that ACT number downward. And so I think seeing the outcomes that we're seeing from Mississippi really are important and should inform our decisions there. Christy, I want to follow up on another point that Dr. Vanderford made, was that transparency and simplicity is really important in this. And, I just wonder, that certainly is my take as I've dug into this as well. From your perspective, looking across the country, is that an area that seems to be an indicator of success for these? And what are some other sort of good practices and maybe some places where states have failed to effectively use accountability to drive student outcomes?
Right. So based on our work in accountability, so I've been in the accountability game for over 20 years, first implementing our system in Florida pre No Child Left Behind in the late 90s to date. And we have come up with a series of fundamental principles that good accountability systems that result in improved student outcomes encompass. All accountability systems across the country are different, but we do know that systems that use transparent, clear descriptors is our first or key fundamental principle. So people have to understand what the rating is and how those ratings are sequenced. So Mississippi, Florida, Utah, and 15 states use an A through F system, like Louisiana. So that's the good first step or first start, is making sure you have something that people, parents, taxpayers, business leaders understand. The second is making sure that you're focused on objective and concise outcomes of student learning. You want to focus on the things that are directly important to students and directly important to learning. So making sure you're focusing on proficiency, on growth, on rigorous graduation expectations, on college and career readiness, rather than focusing on the inputs. You don't want to focus on, how many minutes a student is in class or what credential a teacher has. All of those things go into a successful education, but you want to measure what's coming out on the backside, which is important. That brings up another conversation about growth. Growth is an important feature to have in your accountability system, and you should be measuring growth to proficient or advanced achievement. We want to make sure that all students have the opportunity to demonstrate growth, and if the school is credited with that student demonstrating growth, that they'll eventually reach a proficient or advanced level of mastering the state standards. We have seen too many missteps in measuring growth in other states that look at whether or not students are doing better than their peers. Comparing to peers creates, first of all, a zero-sum game, which you never want to use in accountability, but it also sets an ambiguous expectation that may or may not result in a student reaching proficiency. Just because you scored better than I did this year than last year doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be successful moving forward. I want to know whether or not students are mastering the state standards or mastering more of the state standards moving forward.
And let me just to interrupt for viewers, just to get some definitions. So when you say the word proficiency, does that mean grade, you're at what the standard is for grade level, and then mastery is, can you give us some definitions kind of around those?
Sure. All states use different definitions, Florida, Mississippi, whatever. The federal government requires you to define proficiency, and that is meeting grade level standards. So a majority of states say that proficiency is their achievement level that's meeting grade level standards. Some say it's satisfactory. Some say it's just simply meeting. Advanced is something above that. So you're not just proficient, you've mastered all the proficiency expectations and you have more knowledge or expectations than what they have for you at fourth grade. Same with mastery. That's generally a higher level of proficiency as well.
Great. Thank you.
And so the other important piece of the school accountability calculation, as Dr. Wright said, is measuring the lowest performing students. So if you really want to rise the tide across the state, you want to focus on the lowest performing students in each school, making sure that we're really addressing the needs of those students that are struggling, whether you're in a high performing or a low performing school, and targeting those students for additional help, support, intervention, and including them again in your accountability system. I think a lot of the inclusion of this lowest performing indicator has helped a lot of states narrow the achievement gap across the board, as well as improving overall student performance. And then finally, as we're talking about growth and proficiency, I know there's a lot of debate about how much weight should each of these indicators have. That's a real challenging conversation. It's a policy conversation, but going back to what both Paula and Dr. Wright have said is that you have to weight those indicators as you want them to occur in the classroom. So if you really value students meeting grade level proficiency, you want to weight that pretty heavily in your calculation. If you only care about whether or not students are making growth, especially if it's just compared to their peers, you're not going to get the expectation of meeting grade level proficiency. So once you have a solid or strong growth calculation of measuring growth towards proficient or advanced achievement, you'll want to probably balance those, especially in the early grades. But once you get to the later grades, you're probably going to want to back off on that growth component and focus more on college and career readiness, more on rigorous graduation expectations, and making sure that those kids are prepared once they leave high school, rather than just making growth. Because making a little bit of growth when you're in 10th or 11th grade isn't going to make sure that you're ready once you graduate from high school to walk into a career or college.
Yeah, I think that I just want to echo everything that Christy just said, particularly about looking at the growth of the lowest children, because as I said, when we started this, we were 50th in the nation, and that's where the majority of our children were. So as I was touring the state and talking to superintendents as we were getting ready to really launch this, I said, you supervise principals. So the first question you need to ask a principal when you go into that school is, have you identified the lowest 25%? And if the answer is yes, then you say, show me the list. And then as you look at the list, your next question is, and what are you going to do about each individual child? Because that's the thing, and I say this all the time, behind every data point, there's a face. And if you don't identify that face and that person, you're not going to know the interventions that that child needs, because there is not a one size fits all for every child. And so that's really why I feel so strongly about our accountability system, because I feel like at the elementary and the middle years, it's really weighted in exactly what we want them to be focusing on, which is ensuring that our children reach proficiency, ensuring our children are growing. And then, as Christy just said, backing it up then in high school with what is it you now want our high school students to be focusing on and our teachers and our leaders to be focusing on.
It's such a great point. And, I think sometimes we forget at the end of the day, this is about kids and,
That's right.
And their outcomes. And it's all too easy to let the adults in the system drive the conversation. But all of our job as we talk about this is to make sure kids have the opportunities and are afforded the opportunity to be ready for college or career or whatever awaits them after we release them from the system here.
That's exactly right.
And this model that we currently have really does focus on growth. We shifted from a model that had a predictive growth measure to one that has an actual growth measure. I mean, your student either meets growth or they do not meet growth. So I think that has really been a great advantage to the growth component in the new system compared to the previous systems that we've had.
But that's a great point. And I want to just pause for a minute and remind our viewers two things. One, if you're finding this conversation interesting, and I hope you are, I sure am, there's a little share button there on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Go ahead and click that and let the folks in your networks hear this very, very important conversation. It's a part of education that doesn't get talked about enough. And frankly, from my point of view, it's a part of education, transparency and accountability undergird all the things that we want to do to help make sure that every kid has a chance to attend a school that fits him or her.
That's exactly.
If we don't have good accountability and transparency, all the things we want to do on choice and expanding options, and it just makes that all the more difficult. So this is really important, and we may have some time at the end for questions. So if you're watching, and just go ahead and put a question there in the chat, and we'll get to some at the end if we can. Everyone's busy. I won't keep you too long, but let me go back to Mississippi. You talked a lot about the progress you've made. What have you learned? As you look back on having implemented this and the journey to get there, what are the big lessons learned having done this?
Well, I think the first is setting very high expectations, and because I'm a firm believer that children will do and can do what you tell them they will do and can do, and support them in getting there. So I think that that's the first thing. I think that years ago, I think we suffered from a culture of low expectations. And I was firmly a believer that children can accomplish far more than we were doing. And so I think setting a high bar for standards in our curriculum and a high bar where accountability is concerned, because we've seen what's happened over the years. We've seen the growth in children, but we've also seen the growth in our districts and in our schools. I think being transparent about that is critical as well. Christy mentioned that. I'm a firm believer that the data are what the data are. It is not a finger pointing exercise. It is, this is where you are. This is how many children you have that are proficient. This is how many children that you have that aren't. This is how many kids that grew. This is how many kids that did not. The same thing with graduation, et cetera. And I think that parents want to know that. They want to know the truth about what is going on with their children. And I think that, and then sticking to your guns, because there's a lot of folks that would love it to be easier, right? It's always easier to lower the score. It's always easier to make the bars, not that hard to get over. We actually increased the expectation in our law. When the law was first written, all children, we've got a 5-level system, one being the lowest, and all children had to do was score above the lowest level. That's all they had to do. And I went back to the legislature and I said, look, if you're expecting proficiency, then you need to raise the bar, because it was written in law. And I said, give the districts 3 years notice, but let them know that in 3 years, they've got to perform at a 3 or higher in order for children not to be retained. And guess what? Our teachers did exactly what we expected them to do, which is getting more kids proficient. And there was the, oh my gosh moment, when we did that, but it paid off. We set a higher bar and our kids are crossing that bar and doing well. So you've got to, and the going can get tough. I can tell you that. There's always the voice that says, yeah, but, and you can't be the yeah, but girl. You've got to be, no, this is what we expect of all of our children. And that's the reason I think that we've gotten the results that we have.
And let me just highlight some of those results, because they keep saying they were 50th in the nation. They were 50th in the nation. Let me tell you where they are now. So I got to start working in Mississippi 10 years ago, and their commitment to high expectations has moved them from 50th in the nation to 23rd in 4th grade math and to 28th in 4th grade reading. That's astounding. Mississippi has 74% of their students receiving free and reduced price lunch. 48% of their population is Black. 4% of their population is Hispanic. And so for them to catapult themselves so far forward with high and rigorous expectations, there wasn't a big change in funding. There wasn't a big change in other policies. I mean, there was a focus on academics and transparent accountability and reporting, and a change in the culture of expectations. And I think that is just so important. Right now, compared to their peers, their free and reduced price lunch students are second in the nation in 4th grade math. Second in the nation, 4th grade math. That's amazing. Just high expectations. And so I just really want to focus on that. And again, the whole money piece, Mississippi is one of the lowest FTE funded states in the nation. And they are doing more with less, simply with rigorous expectations and a belief in their students. And that comes from having top-notch leadership in the state, and the executive and the state chief and their whole department really having faith in their educators that this can happen. So they won't talk about it in the context of how great they are, but I certainly will, because it's been amazing. I mean, this is in literally the last 10 years, and this is amazing improvement. So we know Mississippi has just been a huge commitment. There are other states that have made progress. I mean, Florida was, 20 years ago, Florida was sitting where Mississippi is and has held that rank. So they're now 20 years in the making. Utah's another state that's made progress as much as this. They also have improved 20 plus ranking points in NAEP. They're 4th and 6th in 4th and 8th grade reading right now. So there's a lot of states that have made strong improvements. Looking to Mississippi, I think, is key for your state, just geographically and demographically is a good place to look.
Well, thanks, Christy. I just wanted to add, when NAEP came out in 2019, and we did as well as we did, 2 of the statistics that I'm proudest of, because we've got the highest level of poverty in the nation, our children in poverty, be they white, Black, or Hispanic, outperformed all of their other peers nationally. And that sent such a powerful message across our state that our poorest children could do as well as they did. And so that warms my heart every time that we talk about it, because those are the little ones that are going to need the help the most.
Yeah, and obviously I hope all of our education policy leaders are listening right now, and trust me, we'll send this to them, so they will. But it's such an important story. It's our story, right? It's the where Louisiana sits right now. It depends on the list. We're 49th or 50th, and some of the discussion, unfortunately, is around making those scores even, frankly, I would argue, more inflated, right? To weaken some of those areas. And certainly we have called for sort of a reset of let's just take a step back and rethink this formula to begin with, so that we can set, as you said, Dr. Wright, set those standards high, and then achieve them. that's ultimately what has to be done. Christy, I want to. There's a question in the chat here about, and my parakeets have woken up. I don't know if you can hear them on the PeliCast, but always happens. What step? A question from the chat. What steps can we take in Louisiana to align our accountability system with ExcelinEd's principles, and certainly learn from Mississippi's success? Anybody can answer that, but Christy, maybe you can start.
Sure, super easy. It just takes a little bit of will by your state board and perhaps your legislature, and making sure your department's on board. This is not a first easy step. It wasn't a first easy step in Florida. It wasn't certainly a first easy step in Mississippi, but it's building that trust and building that commitment, and having everybody on board. So in Mississippi, we spent a lot of time pulling in the House and Senate education chairs, working with the governor's office and the State Department as a working group with select educators from the state to rebuild the system. So everybody had some ownership and some share in how the system was being built. Mississippi continues that tradition today. I mean, it's been 10 years of implementing their A through F system, and they continue to bring in stakeholders and keep communication and doors open. ExcelinEd certainly is willing to work in any capacity in Louisiana. We don't charge for any of our services, obviously, but are more than willing to come in and work with them to show stellar examples and best practices from Mississippi, Florida, and other states across the nation as well, and show how these calculations should be constructed to really focus on the student and focus on student outcomes, because we know, it's students that we're looking at and making sure their success is what is achieved through this accountability system. I think over the years, we've been so focused on fine-tuning accountability systems that we kind of lose or forget the purpose of why we're doing it to begin with. So it's recentering that focus and making sure that people understand that this is about kids being successful, and how do we create indicators to ensure if a student meets them, they will be guaranteed success.
And I've got to say that ExcelinEd has been an amazing partner with us. I mean, I cannot say enough about the organization. I cannot say enough about Christy and the help that's provided. There's not a time that I've not picked up the phone and said, hey, I need some help, that ExcelinEd has said, we'll be right there, right? And if it's in person, great. And if it's on the phone, that's great too. But I mean it. You really do need a good partner that alongside, because I think that is also that expertise. I can't say enough about that. As you're starting to develop this, it's helpful to have somebody that also knows what's happening nationally and what's worked well and what hasn't worked well, so that you don't end up making the mistakes that other states may have made.
Excellent. In just a minute, I'll invite each of you to kind of give some closing thoughts and maybe ask you to give some advice to our policymakers as we continue to debate and consider these policies. But before we do that, I just want to ask a follow-up. Dr. Wright, you mentioned pushback that you'll get from a lot of different corners. And I wonder, that's certainly true everywhere. There are members of the status quo who want nothing to change, or as you said, want to make it easier. So what advice do you have for us and our leaders in that? How did you effectively, other than just to say, here we go? But I'd welcome your thoughts on how to deal with that pushback.
Well, you've got to stick to your guns, and the bottom line is you have got to keep children in at the heart of everything that you're doing. This is about children. This is not about adults. Are we wanting to change adult behavior in classrooms and in buildings? Absolutely. That's what an accountability model does. But you've got to believe and set those expectations. Teachers too. Teachers have done an amazing job in Mississippi, and we've provided them a tremendous amount of support along the way. But you can't back up. I mean, I remember very clearly when we got ready to set the cut for A few years ago, and the group that had put it all together thought that a cut for an A should be at the 85th percentile. And I looked at my board and I said, if you got an 85 on an exam, would that be an A? And the board said, well, no. I said, exactly. So even though that came as a recommendation to the board, our board stuck by their guns and set it at 90. So an A is set at the 90th percentile. So you've got to have everybody believing the same thing, and you've got to make sure that everybody's on board. And you're not going to get everybody on board. I need to say that as well. I once was at a conference with an effective schools researcher, and he said, the parable of the sheep is great for church, but when you're talking about school or district or state improvement, you got to get the masses together and move forward. And some will come willingly, and some then you do change hearts and minds when you start seeing results change. Because I think it shocked a lot of people around the state when we started seeing the unbelievable growth that we've had in all areas and in all indicators. In fact, there wasn't an indicator that we were looking at that wasn't improving. People really then believe, like, wow, I guess our kids really can do this. And so then the support came, along the way. But you cannot back up. This is about kids. This is about their futures. And you've got to put a stake in the ground, and you got to stick with it.
Amen. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and 20 years later, we are still defending accountability in Florida. I mean, the people that are held accountable by the system generally aren't your biggest supporters of the system. So you are continuously making sure that you're not retreating. I mean, rigorous expectations are tough. It's not easy on the people that have to implement them. Yes, it is getting harder and harder to educate kids, but that doesn't mean we should lower expectations. I mean, we need to be very clear that education is about kids. It's about improving the state of knowledge and being in our communities. And education is not just for the sake of education. It promotes business development and economic expanse and civic mindedness. And education is really just merely an indicator of what our future holds. So if your education system's on the upswing, look to Mississippi. They're going to be an economic powerhouse in a few years. I mean, people are going to be moving there, looking there, trying to make their way down there. They have great weather. The Magnolia State's beautiful. They're, top notch. But if you have performance that's consistently at the bottom, you're going to continue to struggle for what the future holds for your state, not just in the sake of education, but a lot of other indicators as well.
Well, I am a competitive person, so I'm ready for Louisiana to get our Dukes here and meet the challenge that you've laid down. I just want to invite each of you, and Dr. Wright, maybe we'll start with you, and then we'll move around the circle. But final thoughts, anything we missed, or just advice to Louisiana policymakers as we tackle a lot of big questions on education coming up.
Well, my best advice is you got to start somewhere. And the place that you start is looking with your end in mind. And the end in mind is children graduating, college and career ready for life, and ready for anything that life throws at them. And so that starts all the way back down in pre-K. But you've got to start and then forge ahead. And forge ahead even amidst the noise. And keep your focus on what your focus is, and that is on children. That is always on children, regardless of age.
Great. Dr. Vanderford?
As we've already said, establish those high expectations and identify your non-negotiables. We need to work with teachers, as I alluded to. We engage stakeholders across the state of Mississippi, from government officials to teachers in the classroom. And when you bring that group together and you have those expectations outlined and those non-negotiables identified, then the group can begin to work around those and work together. And there's transparency in the development of the model. There's not a team within the organization that's developing the model and then presenting it to the state board for approval. We have a number of levels, beginning with what we refer to as the accountability task force, that actually develops the policies and the guidelines and the business rules around the model. And then that works through our Commission on School Accreditation and through our Technical Advisory Committee, and then on to our State Board of Education, which starts an APA process for public comment and input into those changes. And, the input's not always what we like, but then we just have to circle back around and say, at the beginning, this was our expectations, these were our non-negotiables, and we're not wavering. So we continue to recommend to the board that this is the rules. I mean, this is the model. And then I think a cycle of continuous evaluation and improvement. And that's one thing when we established this model that the board directed us to do, and we do that annually by establishing a new accountability task force each year who's charged with evaluating the business rules of the model and making any changes that may be necessary to that. So not only is the model transparent for parents and for educators as far as the outcome and what you see in interpreting the data, it's transparent in the development of the model as well and the rules around that assignment.
Thank you so much. Christy?
Everything that Dr. Vanderford and Dr. Wright have said, agree 100% and keep espousing those. Keep the student at the center. You have to see the trees for the forest and the forest for the trees. You can't just ignore one or the other. And just a reminder that it's not accountability itself that improves student outcomes, but the data that it produces that inspires the action that will improve the student outcomes. So making sure that you are focusing on the right data and the right indicators, so you're having the right conversations that are actually going to move the needle. The culture of expectations is imperative to all of this, and the leadership and the consistency is also really important. So thank you for asking these questions and having us be part of this. I'm grateful to have worked with Mississippi. Hope we get to work with Louisiana too. We know this is possible. We just have to believe in our kids and our educators.
Amen. Great way to wrap us up. Thank you all so much for what you do, for your service to kids and parents and families all over Mississippi, all over the country. This is an inspiration, certainly to us, and we're grateful for all that you do. And that wraps us up. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back next week. Keep your eye on this space with another great episode of the PeliCast with some announcements here from the Pelican Institute. So keep an eye out for that. You're not going to want to miss it. And keep an eye next week on Bessie as they take up these and other big decisions, and our public servants come together to chart a course for Louisiana's future. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your Friday.
Thank you. Thanks so much.